Jim, thank you for joining us today. It's great to have you back in Atlanta.
It's great to be back here in Atlanta. This still feels like home. I was saying I was actually stayed with my mother and had dinner last night, so it was great to be able to be back here. I was born at Georgia Baptist Hospital, and kind of this is still home to me.
Well, Jim, you are always welcome to come back to Atlanta, and we hope we'll have a chance to get you here often.
Don't tell that to the governor. They're going to start the whole move to headquarters thing all over again, so, but thank you.
Well, Jim, it's particularly pleasing to have you back here, and Jim has a very interesting career. If you look at the Atlanta Business Chronicle insert, you'll see a great article about Jim and his background, and maybe you can tell the audience in particular how you ended up being the CEO of Red Hat from a position where you were the COO of a major airline, Delta Airlines, here in town. How did that happen?
Well, yeah, I will say sometimes just luck shines well. So yeah, I was chief operating officer, so I ran Delta day-to-day through the bankruptcy restructuring, which many of you are aware of. Sorry if you ever lost your bags. I always have to say that in Atlanta. Sorry if I lost your bags. At some point I probably did. So when we emerged from bankruptcy, the board, a new board is constituted in that situation. They wanted to bring in, a new CEO, and so we parted ways very, very nicely. But there really wasn't a role, just given there was a new person. So I literally thought I would go to some other big company, more turnaround things, and I got this random call about Red Hat. And I'm a tech geek. I have a degree in computer science, and I remember I went and talked to him, and I really wasn't thinking that hard about it. And I came back, and my wife says, "You're going to join that company." And I said, "Well, why do you say that?" She said, "For the first time in like 7 years, I see a sparkle in your eye." And I do think there's something to, a certain kind of passion about an organization. And she could tell right off the bat, way before I could tell.
That's amazing. I think you were actually a consultant there at Delta Airlines in the past before you came on as COO. So you had a strong consulting career too, which I guess allowed you to really be able to move from one industry to another pretty quickly.
Yeah, I actually joined Delta at noon on 9/11. I was a partner at BCG, and at the time it was Leo Mullen was CEO, asked me to literally start at noon on 9/11 to become treasurer. So,
wow.
But yeah, I think there is a background, but also just running a large organization that is heavily technology reliant. I do hope I bring a perspective of a large IT user and recognizing technology is not there for technology's sake. It's there to actually solve business problems. And so hopefully bringing some of that's helped Red Hat as we think about how we work with our customers.
So Jim, a lot of people in the audience know about open source, but there's some that may not be quite familiar with a model where you end up giving away software for nothing and making money. So you came from an airline where we all know we pay a lot of money to get into a seat. Here you're going to a business where you don't get any money for giving the software away. How does it work, and what kind of transition was that for you from a traditional business into this very unique open source world?
Yeah, so I'll try to quickly talk through the model, because I always get asked, how do you make $3 billion selling free software? It's a good question. So what we do is we take this amazing thing called open source, where mainly Web 2.0 companies, it's much broader than that, but today a lot of this innovation comes from the Googles, Facebooks, LinkedIn's, Yahoos of the world. And that's great that they do all this innovation in open source, but they're not writing that software with users in mind. They're writing with themselves in mind. So we take this, we stabilize it, we define a life. So as we say, when the bash bug happens or Heartbleed or all these other things you read about, those get fixed upstream in a brand new version of Linux that's incompatible with all your software. But if you're running SAP or a stock exchange or anything else, you want to make sure you're getting patched with your software still working. And that's what we do. We have a couple thousand engineers who do nothing but patch older systems with security updates you need, bug fixes, et cetera, define life, testing with ISVs. So we basically, we disaggregate software into content, which is free, the source code, and all the other things around life cycling, support, security, maintenance, updates, building certified professionals, and all of that's kind of what we do. So yes, it's all open source, but all that downstream stuff, we basically make it consumable. In terms of you also brought up kind of going from one to the other is, there's a lot of management challenges associated with that. But the biggest gift that I got going from Delta to Red Hat is Delta is a very large I would argue, very well-run traditional organization, really built for driving efficiency. You know, frankly, we'd take the last piece of lettuce off a salad if we could get away with it, right? You know, you don't need lettuce on a salad, do you? No, you try to drive efficiency. And I came to Red Hat, and what I originally thought was complete and total chaos, and I thought, oh, I'm here to clean this up. What I actually recognized, and it's actually related to the book, and I think this is actually heavily related to CIOs' jobs now. Red Hat, what I thought was chaos initially, luckily I didn't know enough about the software business to be willing to clean it up yet. I was trying to learn the business, and I observed over time it actually is a different way to structure to drive innovation. And I think the big lesson for me going from Delta to Red Hat is I'm not smart enough to really write a book. When I told like people who know me I was writing a book, they fell out laughing. But they kind of basically try to go through and talk about the journey going as a leader from driving efficiency to driving innovation and how different those models look.
So you talk about the book, and John mentioned it too. I happen to have a copy here that it is an excellent book, and I read it again last night. The Open Organization, Igniting Passion and Performance. And I had made notes in the book the first time I read it. Where does a CEO of a busy company get the time to write a book? And secondly is, when you wrote a book like this, how do you expect it to be used by folks in the audience in business? I mean, how can it be applied into the business world?
So first off, writing it is really, really hard. Now, luckily, I had help, right? I have staff that really helped me do it. And I should say, you know, all the proceeds go to open charities. The point of this was never to be commercial, so I appreciate you bringing it up because I do think it's a book that some people have found valuable. But it really is not really a commercial thing as much as I've gotten real religion about a different way to run an organization. You know, they say taking a skeptic and getting a skeptic to turn is the most powerful thing that you can do. And honestly, I was always pretty skeptical in terms of the role that leadership could play in driving innovation. Like I had daily meetings at Delta, and it was first flight performance and load factor builds, and we were really wound tight. And that's what I saw as role of a leader. When I came to Red Hat, I would say I was the frog that was thrown into boiling water. The world has changed. We've automated so many of the rote task jobs that are out there, and the competitive context in which we all operate has changed so dramatically. I would actually argue we have a very well-organized system that we use to manage companies that was built in an era of uneducated people doing rote tasks in a static environment with limited information. And if you think about that as the problem you're trying to solve, to orchestrate that, our current management systems are great at that. But when we think about today, when you have educated people doing kind of non-routine or creative tasks, or at least tasks that require judgment, in a fast-moving competitive context in a world with broadband information sitting in our pockets, well, maybe the engineering solution to coordinate that looks different than this. And I think because the world changes, we say fast, but as an executive, kind of slowly, year in, year out, you don't realize that your organization is sub-optimized for the context in which you live. And because I went from one extreme to the other, I kind of realized, like, wow, this is fundamentally different. And I do think it's something that so many executives are struggling with, which is, wow, I'm being told I need to innovate faster. I'm worried about getting Uberized. And what do? You pedal harder with your existing plans. It's like, well, let me do more planning, or let me do some scenario planning, and et cetera, et cetera. And I say what you get to in the end is everybody finally comes around and says, it's a culture problem. And I always just say, yes, it's a culture problem, but here's the problem. Culture is an output of your management system, not an input. So you can't change culture. And then you usually say that like, oh, this really is a problem. But anyway, the point of the book was to try to describe Red Hat and kind of how we look different. And now, of course, the question I always get asked is, okay, well, I am a traditional company. How do I change? And so I'm spending a lot of time with companies around that right now.
So in that regard, too, your book talks a lot about digital transformation, and we all know the buzzwords now: IoT, hybrid cloud, third platform, lots of other phrases, and digital transformation is one of those phrases, but it really does take on a new life, I think, both in your work and in your culture at Red Hat. Tell us a little bit about that, and particularly companies in the audience that are going through that kind of transformation in their world.
Yeah, so look, I think every company is going through a period of time where Again, you're going from a world that was a little more static, where innovations happen at a slower pace. And so the majority of value creation wasn't the innovation itself, it was the exploitation of that advantage. So you come up with a new product, you have X number of years to exploit that before you need to come up with a new innovation. And so again, execution, the ability to take that and profit, was more important than innovation itself. In fact, a lot of companies kind of got to the point of, I'm really good at execution, I'm just going to buy innovation and then pump that in and execute against that and then buy innovation. And so many companies, if you think about left arm, right arm, have this like really, really strong right arm, which is all about execution, not so much on innovation. And now you start saying two things. You have innovation cycles just collapsing, so the time you have to exploit an advantage is pretty short. And you get innovations that are so disruptive. If you're at Ford and GM, just to pick, I was talking to the CEOs of one of those companies recently, is like, how do you even think about planning when you got these long cycles about people like Uber coming in and completely disrupting car ownership and potentially over time autonomous driving? And how do you even begin to think about these? Or you're in healthcare and you start thinking about, well, what does these new advances or Watson and these other things, what are they really going to do? And so all of a sudden you say, well, it's really hard to plan for that. And the answer is, yeah, you can't. And so what you see with organizations now is you have to be able to act quicker, right? There's this fighter pilot paradigm called the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. And the faster you can do that, the more likely you are to win a dogfight, right? Well, the same thing in business now. It used to be define a brilliant strategy that gets you a competitively advantaged position and execute to that was a core source of advantage. The problem is now you can't define a point in the future because the world's too volatile and uncertain. So execution, your ability to react, to be resilient, to be agile becomes more important. And the problem that we see it, obviously, as a software company, we sell software that does a lot of this, because a lot of this comes out of the open source movement, so DevOps and containers and IoT. Yeah, we got all that. The technology is not the problem, right? There are companies like Google running these things at huge scale, and we can demonstrate that. The problem is, as an organization, how do you move at a fundamentally different pace? And the problem that you see, and that we try to work a lot with companies with now, and again, this is our core business, we're not a consulting firm, but what we see over and over and over is like, hey, we'll buy your software, but what we really want to do is work with you to think about changing. Because you get these methodologies, and I was talking to one CIO a couple weeks ago, and he talks about, it's like, we implemented all this agile stuff, but we have agile nomenclature on top of our traditional waterfall budgeting processes, et cetera, et cetera. And I finally realized it's a culture problem. And that's where everybody comes back. People start to realize it's a culture problem. You always say, well, that's great, you've realized the problem, but you're not even beginning to solve the answer. And so how do you go back and think about what are leadership and leadership trait styles, what you need to do? How do you think about processes in a different way? How do you even think about your organizational structure in a different way? Are all things that organizations have to address to move faster? And one more thing, I know it's a long answer, but IT organizations, I think, are in the most difficult position for two reasons. One is you're on the front line because so many of these technology changes or these changes in business are technology-centric, right? You're getting Uberized by a technology company, or Amazon's coming into this market. And so technology is the answer to a lot of those questions. But I would observe that so many of the leaders in IT today came up during the 1990s in the age of restructuring, or re-engineering. And so you think about what re-engineering was: Lean, Six Sigma, black belts. It was all about statistical process control and taking variance out. Well, guess what? Innovation is all about putting variance in. And so you have organizations that are really, really good at generating 5 nines of reliability, thinking about long planning cycles, and you're basically saying, you're now at the epicenter of my corporate strategy and whether I win or lose. And by the way, all of the muscles that you've built, you have a really strong right arm, like the strongest in the company, right up there with supply chain management in terms of like process control. And you have this shriveled up thing over here because so many companies don't even do development anymore. They've outsourced it. And so all of a sudden you have to develop that skill if you're going to survive. But you are probably at the extreme of an organizational culture that's not built for innovation. So you're at the epicenter, yet you have a long way to go. Even the most brilliant, far-sighted, thoughtful CIO, taking your organization from where it is to where it needs to go is just a massive change effort.
So Jim, you're in a very unique position. You have been the COO, senior executive of a major traditional business, an airline. You were a consultant where you were able to see lots of different industries, and now you're with one of the world's leading software companies, frankly, selling into those environments. So for the CIOs in the room and their guests, give us a takeaway from the discussion today. What should people walk away with from this session, from listening to you, from your experiences? What should they walk away with today?
Well, I think a couple things. I think the most important piece is that fundamentally, how you operate has to change in order to be successful. I mean that how broadly. I think for a long time, there were a lot of IT organizations that to some extent were general contractors, right? You were integrating pieces from a set of vendors, and you looked at what the vendors were doing, and you were kind of taking those things in and thinking about how you were going to integrate them. In the world that we live in today, these systems of engagement and all the other buzzwords, I mean, there's some truth to that. Those are custom. And so it's no longer, let me buy XYZ solution. Now, you may buy a part of a solution, so I'm going to buy Salesforce to do a component or this or that, but you're actually writing software now. There's almost no way to build a competitively advantaged position without writing software. So recognizing that you're going to be in a business around innovation, not just around integration. And then secondly, recognizing the sources of that innovation are going to be very, very different. So it used to be, you have a relationship, and I'm not picking on these companies, these are great companies with IBM and Oracle and HP, and you saw their roadmaps, and you had this comfort of here's what's going to happen over the next 5 years. Well, there is nothing that I know of in AI or big data that's not open source, right? The Googles and the Amazons and the Facebooks, Alexa and Hey Google, in order to run those services require massive amounts of AI, and those companies give it away. It's a byproduct of that in open source. So if you're going to do fraud detection in your business, you're going to be consuming a lot of open source. And this is less about open source as much as to say there are new ways that innovation is going to creep into your organization. And so to back up and say, becomes much more about understanding sources and types of innovation. So I have to say, I'm not going to have a filter this wide to talk to a set of trusted partners, and I got to have a filter this wide coming in, and then I have to recognize I'm not integrating pieces, parts. I'm actually having to do net new innovation internally. And then finally, you got to do all that while you're running the store. And that's actually one of the hardest ones to do. It's still when you look at IT budgets. It's how do you free up enough dollars to be able to do that while you're still, in the airline's case, keeping the planes running on time and safety, et cetera, et cetera. And that's one of, I'll say, the social engineering tricks of being a CIO is how you free up enough budget out of your CFO, CEO to be able to actually go through that transformation.
Jim, you have really set the standard in the open source world and in the software world. You've done it by building a company in the Southeast. You've been very loyal to the community in the region. We appreciate that a lot. Thank you for being with us today. I also have to tell you, I love your socks.
I would really like those.
Let's give Jim a hand.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jim.